Thanks, everyone. I know you're all having wonderful conversations, but we did want to maximize our time with our wonderful speakers today, so I think we're going to go ahead and start our program. First of all, I want to thank you all for coming today. I think we all share one thing in common in this room, and that is we're very interested in Japan and learning more about how Japanese see themselves and how they see the United States and how they see the world. So we're delighted today to have an excellent speaker and commentator today. If I could just briefly mention, Sasakawa USA is the sponsor of this event, and just very briefly, for those of you who are not familiar with Sasakawa, we have a brochure outside, but we're a U.S. 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to strengthening U.S.-Japan relations. We work with many other organizations who have a similar goal, such as Pew Research, and we're delighted today to have an excellent speaker from Pew. So I wanted to just briefly mention, you have in your packet biographic information about Bruce Stokes and about our commentator, Emma Chanlett-Avery, so I won't introduce them any further, only to say that both of them have a long experience in Japan, are very respected people whose point of views carry a lot of influence here. So we're very delighted to have Bruce come and talk to us about the exciting work he's doing in public opinion research in Japan. And then Emma is going to have a few comments, and we will leave some time for questions and answers. So if a question occurs to you as Bruce is going through his presentation, please write it down, and I think you'll have a chance to ask your question. So without further ado, I'd like to turn things over to Bruce, and thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you so much for having me and inviting me to share our work, which we've been doing in Japan now for about 16 years on public opinion. And what I hope to share with you is data, much of which we think is evergreen in the sense that it's about values, it's about perceptions that don't change rapidly over time, although there are a few of them that have changed pretty dramatically in the last year. As you said, Pew and Sasakawa worked together in the past. We really appreciate your support for our work and all of your interest in both Japan and the U.S.-Japan relationship and the importance of public opinion and trying to understand that relationship. Just very briefly, the Pew Research Center is based here in Washington, if you don't know it. We've been around for about 20 years. We do public opinion research and big data research on a variety of topics. I work on some of the global attitudes work, but we have a range of materials available for any of you. All this material that I'm going to talk about and a whole lot more is on our website. It is free, but most importantly, it's searchable. So if you ever wondered, gee, what do the Japanese feel about our bombing of Hiroshima and what, was that justified or not? We actually have data on that. We've actually asked the Japanese. So there's a lot of material on a variety of different topics. This survey was done last year. The margin of error is 3.7%. And as you can see, there's some data in here on other Asian countries' views of Japan, and that data is also there. First off, just to give you an economic context for this. Now, this number may have changed a little bit since last year when we did the survey, but I think what's important here is what we see is the recovery in Japanese attitudes towards their economy. That in our survey going back to 2002, the Japanese have never felt better about their economy than they do today, which I think we all know that if the public feels better about the economy, the public mood improves dramatically. But what's interesting is only 19% of Japanese think their kids are going to be better off than they are. This is a phenomenon shared with Americans and Europeans. People in advanced economies do not believe that the next generation is going to be better off financially than they are. This is something I think to watch very, very closely because it's not what we have come to assume up to this point. Up to this point, we assumed that people would always think that the future was going to be better. People are telling us all over the advanced economies they don't believe the future is going to be better. The implications of that we don't know, but I think it bears close watching. We asked people a variety of questions in Japan and all over the world. Is life in your country today better than it was 50 years ago? For people like me, overwhelmingly Japanese say yes. I think that's probably to be assumed. What's interesting is that it's not that different from what you see in emerging markets, for example, in India, places like China. But only 37% of Americans think that life is better today than it was 50 years ago for people like me. So that's a real difference in terms of Japanese and American public opinion. Are they worried about the global economy affecting Japan? About half of Japanese are. But what's interesting is it's young people more than old people who are worried about the knock-on consequences of the global economy. We asked people this in this most recent survey, how do they feel about Japanese, the national government? Do they think it can do what is right for the country? We asked this question all over the world to get a sense of people how they feel about government in their country. 57% of Japanese say that they are somewhat or a lot of trust in their national government. That's roughly comparable to what we saw in the United States, which was 51%, the UK 49%, lower than Germany. Germany 69%. Now, of course, we asked this survey question in Germany before the fact that they haven't had a government for many months. And then we asked people in Japan, are they satisfied with the way the Japanese democracy is working? And 47% said they were dissatisfied. 50% said they were satisfied, which is basically within the margin of error. So the Japanese public is divided on the state of democracy in Japan. And what's interesting is the people who are most dissatisfied are people who are 18 to 29 years of age. Only 32% of that age group are satisfied. We then asked people about various aspects of democracy. And again, we asked this all over the world. We wanted to see not only how people felt about democracy, but how did they feel about various forms of governance. So we asked people, do you think representative democracy is the best way to run Japan? Do you think it'd be better if the public were able to vote on major national issues, direct democracy, more referenda? As you can see, there's overwhelming support for representative democracy in Japan, which is the form of government that Japan has. But there's also a 65% of the population say they would actually prefer to have the ability to vote on major national issues. Now, I would remind you, there's never been a national referendum in Japan. So this is an aspiration, not a reflection of some experience, but it may actually get at the underlying issue of people don't believe their voice is being heard, and they would like to be able to express their voice. 49% of Japanese say it would be best if the government was run by experts, which is roughly lower than in some emerging markets, higher than in some of the other developed economies. What is probably not surprising is that the age group that is most supportive of rule by experts are young people. 63% of people 18 to 29 say government by experts would be a good thing for Japan. Very little support for rule by a strong leader, even less support for rule by the military. It is probably interesting to note that even among those people who do support rule by a strong leader or the military, it's less educated people in Japan. It's people with a high school education or less who are more attracted to that kind of form of governance. We ask people every year around the world how they see the threats to their country internationally. 76% of Japanese are worried about cyber attacks from other countries. That's up from 71% in 2016. So there seems to be a growing concern about this. The one that jumps out is that 62% of Japanese think the power and influence of the United States is a threat to Japan. Now, frankly, one of the limitations of survey research is you don't know what people were thinking when they told you this. You'd have to have focus groups, et cetera, to follow up and say, well, what do you mean? But what is interesting, it seems to me, is that it was 52% in 2016. So it's gone up 10 percentage points in 1 year. I'll leave it to you to say what's changed between 2015 and 2016. In 2016 and 2017. But it does seem to me that that's probably something to follow. And what was interesting is that it was young people more than old people who were worried about the power and influence of the United States. We asked people in Japan, does having people from many different backgrounds and ethnic groups, religions, and races make our country a better place to live or a worse place to live? A majority of Japanese say it makes Japan a worse place to live. The generation gap on that is quite interesting. 44% of 18 to 29-year-olds say it would make Japan a better place to live. So young people seem to be more open to diversity than older people. I think probably not surprising. Only 17% of people 50 years of age and older in Japan think that diversity would be a good thing for Japan. Other international issues, the Japanese are, about only half of Japanese think that the Chinese economy is good for Japan, and actually that's kind of gone down a little bit over time. No one in Japan thinks that the Chinese military power is good for Japan, but I think that's probably not surprising. Not surprisingly, again, the Chinese public is overwhelmingly negative on China. Only 13% have a favorable view of China, 83% have a negative view. People are worried about Chinese power and influence. The Japanese are incredibly worried about the North Korean nuclear weapons program. As you can see, 66% very concerned, so the intensity of that concern is quite high. But the Japanese would like the world to pursue economic sanctions as the way to address this question, not deepening ties with North Korea. What we didn't ask, and I kind of regret we didn't ask at the time, is what about attacking North Korea? We did not ask that. I think if we were to ask this question again, that should be one of the options. Not that I would expect in Japan there'd be much support for that, but it would be interesting just to know what their response would have been. We asked people about attitudes towards Russia and Putin. As you can see, there's very little confidence in Vladimir Putin. Less concern about Russia's power and influence than there had been in terms of US power and influence or Chinese power and influence. So I would say Russia is not on the radar screen in terms of Japanese concern the way, say, it was when I lived in Japan in the 80s, and there were fights over the Northern Islands, and there was a lot of concern about that. What is interesting is that young people in Japan are much more likely to have confidence in Putin than older people. Again, this is something we see again and again. In most cases, in response to most questions and in most countries, 18 to 29-year-olds are more open to the world than older people my age. We don't know why that is. It may well be that they came of age and formed a worldview when the Cold War was over. China was integrated into the global economy. Globalization was a fact of life. And so young people are just more open to these things. Or it could be that they are romantic and naive and haven't really suffered life yet, and maybe their attitudes will change over time. But I think it's one of the things from public opinion data that we should try to bear in mind and watch the evolution of generations and their worldview as things change. Views of Japan are actually improving in Asia, based on the countries we survey. Not so much in India, which is down. The Abe government's efforts to get closer to the Modi government don't seem to have much effect on public opinion. But you can see Australian opinion of Japan has increased by 10 percentage points. in the last 4 years. In Vietnam, it's up 9 percentage points. South Korea even is up 9 percentage points. Even though it's still relatively low at 31, it's improved. Finally, about Japan and the United States. We asked Japanese, and to my mind, this was fascinating. We asked people all over the world about their news habits and, how closely do you follow the news, how closely do you follow the news about your own country. But we also asked people how closely do you follow news about the United States in particular. And 23% of Japanese say they follow news about the United States very closely. Now, 23% doesn't sound like much, I suppose. But the median in 38 countries is only 14%. So it's 9 percentage points higher than the global median. Moreover, there are only 3 countries in the world, in the 38 countries we surveyed, where publics were more likely to say that they follow news about the U.S. closely than in Japan. So the Japanese, relative to other countries, other publics, in fact, are very tuned in to what's going on in the United States. And we see this in some of the other statistics about attitudes towards the United States. We periodically ask people about American soft power. As you well know, this is supposed to be one of our strengths. We have this great soft power. The Japanese actually, data suggests that that's a pretty strong factor in U.S.-Japan relations. We ask people, is it good that U.S. ideas and customs are spreading here? This, frankly, I wrote this question. I know exactly what we're trying to get at. How do you feel about the Americanization of your culture? Now, we couldn't ask about Americanization because people would say, well, I don't want to be Americanized. But how do you feel about U.S. ideas and customs? 62% of Japanese feel pretty good about them. Only 38% of the rest of the world does. How do you feel about American ideas about democracy? Japanese still revere American democracy. 63% have a good opinion of American ideas about democracy. That's 20 percentage points higher than the rest of the world. What about, do you believe that the U.S. respects the personal freedoms of its own people? I can tell you this is something that's taken a great hit in Europe, for example, but not in Japan. Over 2/3 of Japanese say they see America as protecting personal freedoms. And the Japanese love American culture, movies, music, et cetera, but so does the rest of the world. Now, this is a graph showing favorability of the United States in blue and confidence in the U.S. president in red over time. You might notice a few things. It was pretty low at the end of the Bush administration, jumped up. Both confidence in the U.S. president and favorability of the U.S. jumped up over time, bounced around at a fairly high level, and now has dropped down to the levels it was at the end of the Bush administration. I can tell you Japan is not alone. Almost this exact same image you find in European public opinion. A slow decline under the Bush administration, a dramatic increase under Obama, bounces around up there, and then falls off the edge of the table. As a German government official and the chancellor said to me in Berlin, oh, that's interesting. It took Bush 8 years to get to this low point. It took Trump 2 months. So we don't know what's going to happen when we do the survey again this year. But this is the point we're starting at. Now, what is interesting, though, in Japan, and different from, say, many countries in Europe, is even though there has been this 54 percentage point drop in confidence in the U.S. president in 1 year in Japan, the drop in Sweden was 83 percentage points. The drop in Germany was 75 percentage points. The drop in the UK was 57 percentage points. So the drop in Japan is actually, relatively speaking, less than in many other countries. And it does not seem to have affected the favorability of the United States as much as it has in some other countries. So that bears watching, I think, going forward. What is interesting is that in a number of these indicators about the United States, it is young people in Japan who are more favorable towards the United States than older people. Again, I think not a surprise given what we know about young people in general and their openness to the world, but also that means that the next generation has not lost faith in the U.S. or confidence in the U.S. To the same degree as people my age. So that's kind of interesting. It is true that the Japanese overwhelmingly disapprove of many of the Trump administration's signature policies. The numbers are pretty strong. They are comparable to those in Europe in terms of opposition. But again, what's interesting is that even though young people in Japan do not support these policies, whether it's building the wall or excluding Muslims or pulling out of trade agreements in the Paris Climate Accord, they are relatively more likely to support these policies than older people in Japan. We did ask people, we do this every first year of a new president, we asked people about personal characteristics of the new incoming president. The Japanese say they see Donald Trump as arrogant, intolerant, dangerous, and not qualified to be president. This is not that much different than what we found in the rest of the world, to be quite honest. But again, young Japanese are less critical of President Trump than older Japanese. They see him as a strong leader. People my age don't. They see him as charismatic. People my age don't. They see him as arrogant, but not quite nearly as arrogant as people my age do. So again, I think it's one of those things where there's a generation gap, which bears watching. One of the interesting questions, though, about these surveys we've been doing since 2002 about attitudes towards the United States, attitudes towards the U.S. president, is the question, I think, the intellectually honest question we have to ask ourselves: does it matter? You know, does it have a knock-on effect if you see a change, say people have lost faith in the U.S. or in the U.S. president? Do they trust us on substantive issues less? And we ask people, would the U.S. help Japan in a conflict with North Korea or China? Do you expect that we would? And I can tell you that overwhelmingly the Japanese say, no, we still think we can rely on the United States, even though we've just told you we have our favorability towards the United States has gone down, our confidence in the U.S. president has gone down. And what's interesting is this is the same thing in Europe. We ask Europeans who had just told us that they didn't like this new president and the favorability of the U.S. had gone down. Do you think that do you still trust the United States will come to your aid in a war against Russia? And people say yes. So again, I think we have to put these public opinion sentiments in context in terms of the kind of immediate knock-on consequences to belief in the reliability of the United States. However, the Japanese do expect that under Trump, the relationship is going to get worse. 41% say it's going to get worse, only 34% say it's going to stay better, and only 17% say it's going to better, and 34% say it's going to stay about the same. So by more than 2 to 1, Japanese believe things are going to get worse. So this is some of the highlights of the findings of our survey on Japan. Happy to answer questions or elaborate on some of these things. Do we do that now? Or yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Sit here. Great.
Well, great. Can everybody hear me? I think I'm mic'd now. Thank you so much for that presentation. That was really helpful. As Ambassador Zumwalt mentioned, I'm Emma Chanlett-Avery. I work at Congressional Research Service. It is the federal government, which means, first of all, I have to offer a disclaimer that anything I say here doesn't represent the views, certainly, of the U.S. Congress. And it also means that I have a salary again as of this morning, which is nice to have. I really appreciated this presentation mostly because as a Japanese policy person, we spend a lot of time hearing about the elite views in Japan, and it's really helpful to get sort of a background and a context of what the Japanese people are saying, because I think sometimes there's a pretty significant gap there. So I think it's helpful to consider how all of these views will have implications for the U.S.-Japan alliance, for the U.S.-Japan relationship as a whole. So I wanted to ask just a couple of questions, a few slides that struck me particularly, and then draw out some more implications before we turn to the audience here. First, on the methodology, do you do cell phones? I noticed that you do telephone calls.
The surveys in Japan and other major industrial countries are by telephone and increasingly by cell phone. Because large swaths of populations in advanced economies don't have landlines anymore.
Great.
Just so, for those of you who aren't Japanese, there are still surveys done in Japan by mail, which I find amazing.
You must have to take into account who's actually going to fill that out and send it back in too, right?
It's a little hard to tell, yeah.
You mentioned this. I was struck probably just because I just came back from India. We were just talking about this before. But why so low, that opinion of the Japanese in India? And is it reciprocated? Because that wouldn't spell a lot.
I mean, it's a very good question. The don't knows were relatively high because all of our surveys are done throughout the entire country. So in Japan, it's both urban and rural areas. But in places like India, it is the entire country. So it may have something to do with that. And then if you take out the don't knows, you get more volatility. I mean, at the initial level, I think it is just that whatever this charm offense is between Abe and Modi, it hasn't percolated down to the public yet.
Right.
But then again, a lot of things haven't in societies that are poor and rural and uneducated. I was just in rural Rajasthan in November and was talking to a group of 9 Indian men in this little village of 600 people. And so I said to them, have you ever heard of Donald Trump? And only 4 of the 9 had, even though they all had cell phones. And one of them, the only thing he knew about Donald Trump was that he had 3 wives. And I didn't want to break the guy's heart and tell him he didn't have 3 wives at once. He had 3 wives seriatim. But so, I mean, I think you have to factor that in.
Right. And it's interesting, too, for me, because it just sort of points to this trend of very leadership-based relationships that I think Abe has pursued. And you saw that actually in the slide on Russia, too. It doesn't seem like the Japanese have a particularly high opinion of Russia, whereas Abe has really sort of pursued a relationship with Putin specifically. So I think it's just interesting to look at sort of some of the gaps that exist there between how Abe is approaching foreign policy, but may not be right there with his public on some of these things. A couple of just little points here. It was very striking that the biggest threat, what was seen as the biggest threat to their country was the cyber attack. Was that driven by a particular event or just more awareness
That's
of it?
interesting. As far as I know, and maybe someone here who follows Japan more closely may be able to fill in the deal. I mean, one of the things you should always do when you see public opinion research is try to find out what the methodology is, which includes when did they take the survey. Because these things are susceptible to events. I don't know if you noticed in the U.S. favorability chart, there was a peak in U.S. favorability that came right after the tsunami. And as we all know, the United States was very forthcoming in its help after the tsunami, and the Japanese public has been very thankful about that, and the government has been, acknowledging it very publicly. And we see this time and again around the world. When there's a crisis, earthquake in Pakistan or a tsunami in Indonesia, the following, and the U.S. tends to be the country that steps in more than any other country, that you get a spike in favorability of the U.S., but it only lasts a year. And then the number reverts to whatever the norm had been before. And so I like to joke, you can rent goodwill, but you can't buy it. But it's a reminder that you need to kind of get a sense of what happened around this time when they were in the field, because it can have a short-term impact on public opinion.
The other thing was about how concerned they are about North Korea.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that, I mean, I assume it's been growing, but we've seen here in the United States, obviously, I mean, concern has spiked considerably in the last year or so, partly because of North Korea's accelerating capabilities. But I mean, I see it because I answer to members of Congress, and their constituents, you know, people in rural areas are suddenly concerned about a war with North Korea. We've never, you know, heard from some of these members before. So I was wondering if you were aware of, you know, how much of a spike that was, or was it more of a gradual acceleration?
Well, we have asked in Japan in the past, and we have it in our you know, past reports. We've actually pulled out the North Korea question because in the past we included the North Korean nuclear program as part of a list of international threats to Japan, as we did for the US and for other countries. There was the same list. And you always got a very high concern about the North Korean nuclear program. And we decided to pull it out because, in part, now the threat is pretty obvious. And we were a little bit worried that when we put, and this, again, you should always look at public opinion questions and see if you agree with how they're worded. We would ask about the North Korea nuclear program, and you'd get very high levels even before maybe you would have thought people would have been worried about it. And we realized that what if we'd ask about the Ethiopian nuclear program? Where people are reacting to the North Korea in the question or the nuclear in the question, and if you'd assign nuclear to any country, people go, oh, that really worries me. So that's why we decided to make it a separate question, and also then the follow-up about what would you want to do about this. But it's very high now. It's higher than it had been, but actually we can't compare this question because it's not the same exact question we asked before.
Right. What were the three countries higher than Japan in terms of paying attention?
In terms of paying attention to the United States,
yeah.
it was an interesting mix. It was Kenya, and I guess because of Obama, I'm not quite sure. Germany, okay, I understand that. And I forget what the third one was. But it wasn't, you know, it wasn't the UK. It wasn't some of the more obvious countries. It was, let's see, what was it? It was, Canada. Yeah, Canada, very obvious country. Okay. Yeah, so it was Canada, Germany, and Kenya.
Okay, I was just curious about that.
But actually, that was I was actually surprised at that. I wouldn't have expected the attention to U.S. news to be as high in Japan as at least people say it is.
Yeah, I wonder if there's sort of a strong awareness or feeling in Japan that they're very dependent to some degree on the United States for their security.
Maybe.
I mean, that would be one
that
of
would
the
be one of the
reasons
explanations.
might,
yeah, and you know, it may well be that's intensified given the North Korean crisis too, or before that the confrontation with China. But I mean, to my mind, it's also a telling sign of kind of the broad-based kind of engagement with the alliance among the Japanese public. Because, again, I mean, this was higher than it was in the UK. It was higher than in Mexico. I mean, places where you might have expected just naturally to have a higher attention on the U.S.
Well, to turn to China, and you noted this in your remarks here, it was very striking that the U.S. and China were basically even in terms of whether or not their power and influence would be a threat to Japan. And I mean, there was ambiguity in a lot of ways. I was interested that, you know, more than half thought that the rising Chinese economy was good for Japan, for example. There's tremendous support for U.S. soft power, yet, you know, clearly something unsettling about U.S. power, too.
Frankly, it cries out, and, you know, look, it's on us. If we had more time or more money, we should do follow-ups because it'd be very interesting. You know, what was it about U.S. power and influence that the Japanese found so disconcerting? Was it the crisis with North Korea? And oh my goodness, you guys could drag us into a war. Was it they clearly said they don't like the new U.S. president. Is it just a residual concern about, you know, the United States? I mean, yes, we're in an alliance with them, but on the other hand, they're in Okinawa and we don't like that. I mean, is it things like that? It's also a reminder that closeness to us and reliance on us is a double-edged sword to many people in their own minds. They may like it and hate it at the same time.
Right, and that goes back to sort of the classic alliance
Yes,
dynamics,
exactly.
right?
Yeah.
Of fear of
Yeah.
abandonment, fear of being
Yeah.
pulled
Yeah.
into conflicts, which makes sense. But I find it particularly just interesting putting these two powerful countries, the United States and China, up there, and you know they go both ways. Whereas the elite in Japan seems to have pretty much decided,
Yes.
you know,
Yeah.
we're threatened
I mean,
by
certainly that's
China.
my experience in talking
We're
to the elite as
hewing,
well.
yeah,
Yeah.
to the United States. And this is where this wasn't part of the survey, but I'm curious about what are the public's views of how Abe has very much drawn himself as close as he can to the president here now and the president's policies, particularly on North Korea, just because we've saw, you know, Abe write an op-ed right before the UN General Assembly that basically full-throatedly endorsed, right?
Yes.
Trump's approach to North Korea, but Japan is, I mean, if not on the very front lines, sort of the secondary lines there, and I wonder about the concern in Japan of their leader who has, you know, got a really firm, pretty firm grasp on political power there, if that's driving some concern in the public.
We don't have any data to assess, you know, how do you, I mean, the question you would want to ask is, you know, how do you feel, how's Prime Minister Abe dealing with, is he doing a good job or a bad job dealing with the United States? We didn't ask that question, so I just don't know.
Right.
It would be a good question to ask, though, because you're right. I mean, certainly the elites one talks to are fairly proud of themselves in terms of how they have dealt with the Trump administration. But whether the public feels that pride or not, we just don't know.
Right. I'm curious about how that
Yeah.
plays out in the future. And I want to just go back a little bit. It looked to me that where the opinion of the U.S. president really spiked was in 2016. And I wonder if that had anything to do with the Obama's visit to Hiroshima.
Oh, I think it did. I think it probably
Which, of course, was incredibly well received. And that visit, I mean, there was a lot of debate and hemming and hawing about whether or not this would be a good idea from the United States side, right? I mean, would there be domestic political blowback? Was there an apology expected? I mean, and it turned out to not, you know, have that much of an effect here either. But I remember seeing that that response by the Japanese public, and thinking this was it was a very nice. It was for me personally, it was a very touching moment. But all of the other advancements that had happened in the alliance under the Obama administration had to do with policies that a lot of the Japanese public didn't necessarily agree with. I mean, the reinterpreting the Constitution, the very controversial security legislation that was pushed through Okinawa presidents, you know, those are all things that may have been good for the alliance, but weren't necessarily supported by the majority or right at the middle for the Japanese people. Whereas here was a president doing something that seemed to be something like that was emotionally resonant for the public.
Yeah, we have a survey that we did a couple of years ago, and we've asked this question periodically going back, and other people have too, so you can compare the change. I mean, basically, the Japanese public increasingly believes that the use of nuclear weapons in Hiroshima and Nagasaki was a mistake, was wrong.
Right.
What's interesting, and I assume that it might be expected, but what's interesting is that the American public is shifting on that issue, that right after the war, overwhelmingly, like, I forget the exact number, it was 8 in 10 or so, Americans said this is the right thing to do. Now, it's not quite half the public who thinks it's a good thing to have done, but it's every time we ask the question, the number goes down, and it's already a majority of people 18 to 29 who believe that the use of nuclear weapons in Hiroshima and Nagasaki was a bad thing to do. So if demography is destiny, there's going to be a point at some point in the future where people my age who might still think that this was a good thing to do or understandable thing to do, we're all going to die off. And I think the American public will have come to where the Japanese public is, maybe not at the same intensity, but to believe that this was a mistake. And so it seems to me that that's one of the reasons why it may be that there wasn't the domestic political blowback in the United States, is that in fact the public has changed, not totally, but in large segments of the public have changed their minds about this 50 years later.
Great, thank you.
Actually, 70 years later, take that back.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So I'm going to stop just talking up here and see if there are questions from the audience, if that's okay?
Great.
Okay, and if you could identify yourself, that would be helpful. Anybody? Yes.
I'm Dave Shear with Party Associates. How does South Korean public opinion vis-a-vis Japan break down by age group?
I'd have, yeah, the question was, how does South Korean public opinion break down by age group? You know, it's only about a third of South Koreans who have a favorable view of Japan. So I wouldn't want to, my recollection is there's not a whole lot of difference. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if young people were slightly more pro-Japanese, but by the same token, when a couple of years ago we asked a question in Korea and China about has Japan apologized sufficiently for World War II, the age group that was most likely to say no, they haven't, wasn't, you know, people my age who might, you know, their parents told them about the atrocities at least, or maybe they lived through some of those atrocities. It was young people who clearly only got their understanding from textbooks or the media. So without, I wouldn't want to guess at what it was, but again, it was pretty low. If the national average is only about a third, then it's pretty low.
Over here? I think there's a microphone if you wait for it. Thanks.
Hello, Evan Sankey, Johns Hopkins SICE. Do you have any sense as to how the Japanese view of the Trans-Pacific Partnership has changed in the last year?
We haven't asked that question. We did in the past, and Japanese supported TPP, but not as strongly as some of the other member countries. It was actually more comparable to that in the US, which, you know, the findings which you had to take with a grain of salt because it wasn't really a discussion point several years ago when we asked about it in the US, whereas in Japan it was a huge public policy issue. So I just don't know. I will, though, share with you an anecdote which I thought was fascinating, at least I thought it was fascinating. Right before the election, I was in Tokyo talking about the election, the upcoming US election. And I was meeting with some very, very senior Diet members in the LDP. And I said to them, you know, whoever wins, it's not at all clear Congress is going to approve the TPP, whether it's Clinton or Trump. They both have come out against it, and you know, there's a lot of opposition in the Congress, and so it's not at all clear it matters who wins presidency. We may not be able to get this through Congress. And one of these two senior LDP people started to laugh. I said, well, what's so funny? He said, you don't get it, do you? I said, what do you mean? He said, well, look, Prime Minister Abe looks strong because he got us into TPP. He looks strong because he stared down the agricultural lobby to get the agreement done. And they were just about to pass the implementation. And he's going to look strong there. And then he got this big smile on his face and said, but if we don't have to implement it, we don't pay any political price. So we have to remember that it's for politicians, this is all about politics. And public opinion is important, but it's also about politics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right here.
I'll do with Jay's question. Can you do a survey in regards to Myanmar and the relationship economically from the people's perspective as well as economic?
It's a good question. No, we haven't asked, unfortunately.
Sherry?
Hi, I'm Sherry Martin from the U.S. State Department. I just wanted to ask a couple of questions about young Japanese music in the United States.
Yeah.
So specifically, the favorability. I was wondering, I think that's a question that you've asked over time.
Yes, yeah.
The generational differences that you see there, did you see them in previous years, or is this the first year that you've seen those generational differences?
No, we've seen them previously. And in fact, one of the things we hope to start doing is, since we've been doing this for 16 years, a lot of the people who we were first asking have now moved into the middle-aged category. And it'll be interesting to see whether, you don't interview the same people, so you can't say that this particular person changed his or her view, but is there a shift there in generations, or does that middle-aged group actually carry with it its views from when they were younger, and then you could compare that the new middle-aged group to the old middle-aged group and say, oh, see, my guess is, without us getting into the details because we haven't looked at it yet, that you may not see a statistically significant move between young and middle-aged, and we may have to wait till the young people get older to be 50 plus, and then maybe you see a bigger, statistically significant shift. Or maybe not, because I say, the reason we don't know why young people are more open to the world, no matter how you ask the question, no matter what the topic is, we just don't know why. Is it just that their worldview is different, and is it just because they're young, or is it because they just came of age and formed that worldview when the world was, globalization was a fact of life?
And relatedly,
Yeah.
were there any differences in how closely young people followed the news relative to older people?
How what?
Were there any differences in how closely young people said they were following the news relative to older people?
Oh, that's a good question. I'd have to go back and look, but contact me. I should look and see what that is. And as part of that, I think we could also say how they were following the news. In other words, my guess is it's through social media more than older people, but that's a very good question.
More questions? Kazia.
I'm Kazia from Sasakawa, USA. You mentioned a little bit about differences between low-income, highly educated, and not so educated Japanese. Did you see any gender differences in any of the polling?
In a couple of the questions, women were more worried than men about a number of issues. This is common in a lot of societies and again, you don't quite know why. It may well be that, I have a friend here who does a lot of domestic polling in the US. She argues that it's because women are the ones who are more responsible and worry about the family finances or whatever than us irresponsible men. But there were some differences, especially around dangers facing Japan or challenges facing Japan. But what I find fascinating in doing this public opinion work in 40 countries almost every year is that you always look for stories to tell. And one of the stories you first try to look is there a gender difference? And what is striking is how rare there is a gender difference, not how often. And I can't fully explain that, but I can tell you we look for it because it'd be an interesting story when it does exist. It certainly exists around issues of force, use of force, for example, where women in Japan, but also around the world, are much more opposed to the military use of force than men are. We men tend to be cowboys about these things, and women are more sensitive to the consequences. But in terms of some of these other issues, there weren't that many male-female differences.
Broadly or in Japan specifically?
Well, broadly there aren't. Let me just see. I did make note of it and didn't actually talk about all of them, but there aren't a whole lot of statistically significant ones. That's, for example, U.S. power and influence, a major question, obviously, in this survey. 67% of women say the U.S. power and influence is a major threat to Japan, only 56% of men. So women are more afraid of the United States than men for whatever reason. Yeah.
Yes, right there.
My name is Joe Freeman. I'd like to ask more about the generation gap. Now,
Sure.
you mentioned it for the most recent survey. If you take it back through time, do you see the same kind of generation gap since you've been doing these surveys? or
Yeah,
is it-
we've seen the same generation gap since 2002.
So it's typical, it's not Trump specific?
No, it's not Trump specific. It's typical, I mean, I like to say it's typical of a generation who came of age and formed their worldview after the end of the Cold War, after China had been more closely integrated into the world, after globalization was really a fact of life, you know, after the ease of communication and transportation meant that the world was just more connected than it was. And all of that would suggest why, then, that young people are just more open. But having been a young person once, I also remember being fairly naive and romantic about the world. So, I mean, we just don't know why.
Are there any generation gaps which are Trump specific?
Ooh, that's a very good question. I don't know. We'd have to go back and take a look at whether one has emerged someplace that it didn't exist pre-Trump. I just don't. I doubt it, but I've never actually looked at it that way. Actually, I found another one. For example, confidence in the U.S. president. 32% of male Japanese men, but only 16% of Japanese women. So in terms of who was most likely to have lost confidence in the U.S. president, it's women more than men in Japan. And actually interesting, favorability of the U.S., if you look at the drop in favorability from 72% 2 years ago to 57% last year, who lost favorable views of the United States? It was people over the age of 50. It went from 69% in 2016 to 51% in 2017. So, you know, one of the interesting things when you look at these things is who changed. And on the favorability of the U.S., what was striking is it was older people who became disillusioned with the U.S. More than the other age groups. Yes, woman over there.
From the Wilson Center, did you find any differences in survey responses based on people's party affiliation or ideological identifiers?
It's a little hard to do in Japan because you know, the surveys are of 1,000 people, and one of the questions you ask people are liberal versus, you know, where do you put yourself on an ideological spectrum? Because then you can compare it across countries, because obviously every party is different in every country. But, you know, do you think you're left of center, right of center? Are you medium, middle? There wasn't a very interesting story in Japan. We ask about party identification, but frankly, with only 1,000 respondents, we didn't have a lot of people who identified with other parties. So it's really hard to kind of, you know, if you had a 10,000 person survey, you might be able to drill down and say, well, Japanese Communist Party people thought this, and DJP people thought this, or whatever. But most of the people in our survey were claimed to be LDP supporters.
Other hands?
Yeah.
Ambassador?
Actually, maybe more of a comment than a question, but I was struck by your comment, Bruce, that sometimes doing a survey, it's really hard then when you have the results to interpret what they mean or why. Yeah. And I just wanted to comment on something you mentioned about the converging views between Japan and the United States on the decision to drop the atomic bomb back in 1945. Yeah. And I suspect you're correct that there's a growing convergence because younger Americans' views are different than their previous generation. But I do think there's maybe another factor as well, and that's just based on personal experience. When I was helping Ambassador Roos to go to Hiroshima for the first time when a U.S. ambassador visited on the anniversary of the dropping of the bomb, and there was, to be very frank, a huge concern about U.S. public opinion, not about Japanese public opinion, because we knew the Japanese would be enthusiastic. And the interesting result, actually, when he went and participated in the service, there was one critical editorial, which was the Wall Street Journal, said this was apology diplomacy of the Obama administration, shouldn't have gone. But there was a huge outpouring of support from veterans groups. And essentially what they were saying was not that we think it was a mistake, but that Japan's a good ally, and it's time for us to move on from disputing about the past. We're now friends. So I think that may be part of the factor as well, is even the older generation, who may still have a certain view about whether something was right or wrong, is also the older generation is more willing now to move beyond that because it's a historical issue, not a current event issue anymore.
Well,
but I was curious of your thought on
I'd be
that.
curious what your perception was of the debate inside the USG about this, because my perception is outside, but hearing about this debate was when this first came up, oh, this 70th anniversary is coming up, shouldn't the U.S. president come? And I just remember talking to some members of the Obama administration, oh, we can't do that, you know, and why would we do that? I mean, it was both, it would not necessarily go down well in the United States, but there was a lack of understanding of how important it was to the Japanese. And, you know, to my mind, it's like, to mine, it was self-evident why it was important to the Japanese. And if it was that important to them, maybe as an alliance partner, it should be important to us. And obviously, the administration came around. I do also, though, remember having discussions with senior members of the Japanese government about, well, you know, then shouldn't the prime minister go to Pearl Harbor? You know, wouldn't that be the bookend other issue? Now, and the initial reaction was, oh, we can't do that. And I said, well, why can't you do that? He said, oh, because then the Chinese would want us to come to Nanking, and we can't do that. But they somehow got over that. Yeah.
What I remember, just as an aside to this, was when Abe came to the United States and did the address in front of the Joint Meeting of Congress, had this very successful, that was 2015, I think. There was a question then whether he was going to go to Pearl Harbor on the way. And there was some in the U.S. government that felt that would establish this quid pro quo, this expectation that Obama was going to go to Hiroshima. And there was this very charged debate where the G7 was going to be held, was it going to be in Hiroshima, and therefore like put this pressure on Obama. So that's sort of what I remember from the debate. And my understanding from talking to people who were involved in the decision, it really wasn't, that decision was not made until very late.
Yeah, that's my recollection as well.
That he would go. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you. I have two questions. I came in late, so you might have talked about it. But number one, can you talk about election? Do you have any data on the election? Because PM Abe keeps winning, or LDP. That's one. Number two, I think you talked about North Korea, their attitude towards North Korea, but what about towards South Korea? There is also a little bit of a problem there. So if you can talk about it, I appreciate it.
Unfortunately, in this survey, we tend to not do election survey work. You know, there's a lot of domestic pollsters who ask, you know, who are you going to vote for, or who would you like to see run the government? So we don't do that. And in this survey, we didn't get into attitudes towards South Korea. But we have that in the past, and they were not very good, to say the least. And it was reciprocal. But it would be interesting to redo those questions to see if things have changed over time.
We have time for one more question, or we can wrap it up. Well, great. Thanks for all of your questions. Thanks for coming for the free lunch. Thank you so much. And I really appreciate, also wanted to say that you identify yourselves as a fact tank in a time when facts are out of vogue. That's good to see. So join me in thanking our speaker here. Thank you.